A young entrepreneur from Columbus bought the long-abandoned Holey farm outside Marietta, Ohio, a few years back. And during the sale, the realtor pointed out something strange in the basement. One wall of bricks looked out of place, almost like it didn't belong with the old stone foundation. She casually mentioned that the section had been sealed up since the 1930s and that none of the past owners had bothered to open it. But when the new owner finally tore through those 91-year-old bricks, what he found changed the way historians looked at Ohio's medical past. Hidden behind that wall was the truth about Dr. Amos Fletcher's underground hospital during the cholera epidemic of 1832. A truth so grim that powerful families had kept it buried for nearly a century. It started innocently enough with plans to expand a root cellar. But the story behind that sealed basement traced back to a sweltering summer when cholera, the dreaded Blue Death, moved up the Ohio River from New Orleans, killing thousands as it swept through Cincinnati and Portsmouth before reaching the young settlement of Marietta. The town, barely 40 years old with fewer than 2,000 residents, was thrown into panic. That was the summer Dr. Amos Fletcher arrived. He came with impressive credentials from the University of Pennsylvania and letters of support from Philadelphia doctors. Tall, sharp-featured with gray eyes and prematurely white hair, Fletcher brought an air of authority that frontier communities rarely saw in their physicians, most of whom were little more than barbers or wandering medicine peddlers. Just outside Marietta, the Holey family farm sat on 100 acres, first settled in 1798 by Revolutionary War veteran Thomas Holey. After his death, his son Marcus inherited the land. By 1832, Marcus was 32, farming wheat and cattle with his wife Sarah and their 3 children. He wasn't a doctor, but he had something Fletcher desperately needed: a large, cool stone basement, perfect for isolating patients away from the fearful townspeople. Fletcher proposed turning the basement into a private hospital for cholera victims whose families could pay for treatment. In exchange, he would give Marcus $50 a month, more than the farm made in an entire season. For a struggling farmer, the deal seemed like salvation. Sarah was uneasy about keeping the diseased beneath their home, but Marcus, burdened by debt, reminded her what that kind of money meant for their family. That decision would tie their farm and their name to one of the darkest chapters in Ohio's hidden medical history. By early August, Fletcher had moved his crates of instruments and bottles into the Holloway basement, quickly converting the cool stone chambers into what he proudly called his treatment facility. The largest room became his operating space, with oil lamps flickering against stone walls and wooden tables lined with scalpel saws and jars of medicine. The smaller storage rooms were fitted with narrow beds, wash basins, and chamber pots. Makeshift quarters for patients whose families could afford what Fletcher advertised as specialized care. To outsiders, it looked like a crude but serious hospital. What the Holloways didn't know was that Fletcher had been quietly dismissed from Pennsylvania Hospital just 6 months earlier for unauthorized experiments that killed several indigent patients. His obsession with finding a cure for cholera had already pushed him beyond the boundaries of accepted medicine. The first patient arrived on August 15, 1832. Jacob Vittman, a wealthy grain merchant, brought his daughter Elizabeth, a young woman of 22, who was already showing the dreaded signs: stomach cramps, violent diarrhea, and the bluish skin that earned cholera its nickname, the Blue Death. Fletcher spoke with the confidence of a learned man, assuring Whitman that Elizabeth would receive cutting-edge European treatments unavailable in Marietta's overcrowded public wards. For 25, nearly a year's wages for most men, he promised the best chance at survival. Fletcher insisted on a strict 3-day quarantine, persuading Whitman to leave his daughter in his care. Elizabeth never made it through the first night. Fletcher's radical method, which he called graduated depletion therapy, relied on extreme purging and aggressive bloodletting. Convinced that cholera stemmed from corrupted humors, he bled patients by the quart, not the ounce, and dosed them with massive amounts of calomel, a mercury compound known to induce violent vomiting and diarrhea. Where a typical physician might draw half a pint of blood, Fletcher routinely drained 10 times that amount. Where others prescribed mercury in tiny grain-sized doses, Fletcher administered enough to poison a healthy body outright. He documented everything in neat, precise handwriting, recording Elizabeth's decline as if it were progress. His journal noted her initial bleeding of 24 ounces at 2 p.m., followed by another 20 ounces 4 hours later. After dosing her with 15 grains of calomel and laudanum, he observed what he called marked improvement in humoral balance. He scheduled a third bleeding at midnight, but Elizabeth's body, ravaged by blood loss and mercury, never recovered. She died not of cholera, but of the so-called cure. Fletcher buried her hastily in a shallow grave behind the farmhouse, telling Marcus Holloway that immediate interment was necessary to prevent contagion. When Jacob Wittman returned 3 days later, anxious to see his daughter Fletcher, delivered the news with rehearsed solemnity. Elizabeth had passed peacefully in her sleep after showing signs of initial recovery. The grieving father never suspected that it was Fletcher's treatment, not the disease, that had killed her. Fletcher delivered the news to Wittman with polished sympathy, assuring him that the disease had simply advanced too fast for any physician to stop. "I did everything medical science allows," he said, and the grieving father, grateful that his daughter had at least died under professional care instead of in the squalor of Marietta's public hospital, handed over an extra $10 for burial expenses before leaving unaware of the truth. The next patient arrived only days later, on August 20th, 1832. Thomas Carmichael, a 45-year-old blacksmith from Belper, had been brought in after his family scraped together their savings, hoping Fletcher's training might give him a chance. He lasted 4 days before Fletcher's relentless regimen of bleeding and mercury claimed him as well. By September, word of this private hospital had spread through southeastern Ohio, and with it Fletcher's reputation as the only physician west of Philadelphia offering advanced treatments. Families terrified by the rising body counts in public wards, where prayer often stood in for medicine, began, and hauling their loved ones to the Holloway farm, desperate enough to hand over their life savings. Fletcher's university background and Eastern Polish impressed people who had never before met a doctor with formal credentials. To them, his basement clinic looked like hope. In reality, it had become a machine of death and profit. Fletcher had stumbled into the perfect cover for his crimes, a clientele desperate enough to believe anything, a disease with such a high fatality rate that death drew little suspicion, and an isolated farm where no one monitored what went on underground. By October, his system ran with cold efficiency. Marcus had built him a separate entrance under the guise of protecting the household from infection. But in truth, it allowed Fletcher to bring patients in and corpses out without neighbors or visitors asking questions. His pricing was carefully tiered: $25 for merchants and professionals, $15 for craftsmen, $10 for struggling farmers. Extra charges were tacked on for specialized treatments or European techniques, which grieving families often paid without hesitation. The Holloways, at first relieved by the steady money, began to sense something was wrong. Sarah, in particular, grew uneasy as she listened to the groans drifting up from the basement night after night. "It don't seem natural," she whispered to Marcus one evening. "All them fancy treatments, all that book learning, and still every soul dies down there. Even old Doc Hartwell in town saves one now and again." Marcus brushed her off with the hard pragmatism of a farmer who had watched animals die despite his care. "Rich folks get sick same as poor folks. Maybe they just wait too long thinking money'll buy a miracle." Neither of them realized that Fletcher's real income no longer came from patient fees alone. After each death, he conducted what he called post-mortem examinations, slicing into bodies under the pretense of learning more about the disease. But these were not scientific autopsies, they were dissections for profit. Fletcher harvested organs and tissue, preserved them in alcohol, and sold them to medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. The illegal trade in cadavers was an open secret in American medicine, and professors paid well for fresh material with no questions asked. Cholera victims buried quickly and without ceremony provided Fletcher with the perfect cover. His journal entries from this period, written in the same precise hand that had documented Elizabeth Whitman's suffering, reveal a chilling detachment. One entry read simply, "Patient expired at 3:20 a.m. Specimens extracted and preserved." Fletcher's journal entries from November read like a ledger of horror. After one patient's death, he noted, immediate post-mortem examination yielded excellent specimens. Liver showing advanced cholera deterioration, kidney suitable for preservation, heart muscle displaying typical post-mortem changes. Net profit $37. By then, the Holloway basement had become less a hospital than a slaughterhouse dressed in medical disguise. Fletcher expanded his workspace, installing a broad wooden table in one chamber for dissections, surrounding himself with gleaming scalpels, saws, and rows of glass jars filled with organs suspended in alcohol. The cool limestone walls, once meant to preserve food for a frontier family, now chilled the remnants of human lives, stacked and labeled for shipment to eager medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. His empire of death began to unravel in November 1832 with two fateful turns. The first was the arrival of Martha Cunningham, the 16-year-old daughter of Reverend Isaiah Cunningham of Marietta's First Presbyterian Church. A devoted caretaker, Martha had contracted cholera while tending to the poor in the church's makeshift ward. Though her father lived on a preacher's modest salary, he borrowed heavily to pay. Fletcher convinced that this private physician could save his only child. Unlike Fletcher's other victims, Martha came to him early in the disease, young and otherwise strong, the kind of patient who might actually survive. The second turning point was the unexpected return of Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, Marietta's only other formally trained physician, who had been in Columbus attending a conference on cholera. Hartwell had heard whispers of Fletcher's remarkable results and decided, out of both professional curiosity and courtesy, to visit the Holloway farm on the morning of November 12th. What he found would torment him for the rest of his life. Hartwell arrived around 10 o'clock, and finding the side entrance unlatched, descended into the basement. The sight froze him in place. Martha Cunningham lay unconscious on a table, her skin pale and waxen from massive blood loss. Two basins beside her brimmed with crimson, and Fletcher stood nearby preparing a syringe, the glint of calomel unmistakable. In the dim corners of the room, jars of human organs floated like grotesque trophies, lining the shelves in silent testimony to the doctor's crimes. Fletcher Hartwell's voice echoed against the stone walls. "What in God's name are you doing to this child?" Fletcher turned slowly, his apron soaked through his expression, frenzied more butcher than healer. For a moment the two men locked eyes across the girl's lifeless body, the full horror of Fletcher's secret hanging in the cold air between them. Then Fletcher spoke evenly, as though conducting a lecture. "Dr. Hartwell, I wasn't expecting you. Miss Cunningham is responding remarkably well to graduated depletion therapy. I was just preparing to administer the final dose of mercurial purification." Hartwell rushed to Martha's side, checking her pulse, studying her eyes. "She's dying of blood loss." "Not cholera," he snapped. "How much have you taken from her?" Fletcher, unbothered, flipped open his journal. 42 ounces in the past 18 hours, he said with chilling detachment, with another 16 scheduled for this morning's treatment. The humoral balance is nearly achieved. Hartwell's voice cracked with fury. That's nearly 3 quarts you've drained this girl almost to death. The basement walls seemed to vibrate with the argument that followed. Fletcher clung to his theories, insisting that his methods were rooted in the latest European research, citing case notes and medical authorities no one in Marietta had ever heard of. Hartwell, horrified, demanded that he stop at once and let him examine the other patients. But when Hartwell stormed through the basement, he found every bed empty. Only Martha Cunningham remained alive. The rest had already been buried in the makeshift cemetery sprouting behind the Holloway farmhouse. "Where are they?" Fletcher Hartwell demanded. Fletcher answered without a flicker of shame. "Unfortunately, they succumbed to the advanced stages of cholera before my treatments could take effect. The disease is particularly virulent this season." Hartwell knew immediately this was a lie. Even in the worst outbreaks, mortality rarely climbed beyond 60% under decent care. Fletcher's so-called hospital had produced a 100% death rate. The discovery placed Hartwell in a dire bind. As a physician, he was duty-bound to expose what he had seen, but doing so would entangle the Holloway family who had provided the basement and disgrace some of Marietta's most prominent citizens' men who had trusted Fletcher with their wives, children, and siblings. To admit they had been deceived so completely would stain their reputations for generations in a town where honor and standing were everything. Hartwell did what he could immediately, trying to undo Fletcher's damage by giving Martha fluids and rest, praying her strength might save her. Then he sent urgent word to Reverend Cunningham and a handful of Marietta's most powerful men. That afternoon, the farmhouse filled with the heavy presence of authority. Reverend Cunningham, Judge William Putnam, Merchant Samuel Fearing, and banker Nathan Gilman. Each man had either lost someone to Fletcher's care or had vouched for him to their neighbors. When Hartwell revealed the truth, the room fell silent, the weight of it pressing down like a physical force. Fletcher, once the symbol of learned medicine, now stood exposed as a butcher whose patients had paid dearly for their own destruction. The basement below their feet was no hospital. It was a charnel house, a fraud, a crime scene. Fletcher, cornered and desperate, tried to salvage what he could. He produced his journal and read aloud, in the tone of a professor, before a class, insisting that every cut, every bleeding, every mercury dose was grounded in legitimate science. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "what you see as extreme is in fact the most advanced European medicine. These procedures were designed to save life, not take it. The mortality rate is the fault of the epidemic, not my protocols." Judge Putnam. His voice like ice cut through Fletcher's rehearsed defense. His own nephew had died on that basement table only weeks earlier, and now he stood face to face with the man responsible. "Dr. Fletcher," he said, every word deliberate, "are you telling us that bleeding a 16-year-old girl nearly to death is accepted medical practice?" Fletcher didn't hesitate. "In cases of severe humoral imbalance, yes. The corruption must be drawn from the body before healing can begin. Miss Cunningham's survival will prove the effectiveness of my methods. But Martha Cunningham did not survive. Despite Hartwell's desperate attempts, fluids wrest every ounce of care he could muster. The girl's body was simply too ravaged to recover. She died that same evening, her final breaths witnessed by the very men who had once defended Fletcher's reputation. In that moment, the illusion shattered. He was no longer a physician experimenting at the edge of science. He was a killer. His hands stained, not with the disease, but with murder. The men in the farmhouse faced a decision with no good answers. A public trial would mean justice, but it would also drag Marietta's name through the mud. The scandal would not stop at Fletcher. It would engulf the Holloways who had rented him their basement, and it would taint the city's most respected families who had entrusted their loved ones to his care. property values would collapse, merchants would be ruined, and the carefully cultivated image of Marietta as a civilized, thriving frontier town would be destroyed. Judge Putnam, despite his grief, said it plainly. If this becomes public, it will destroy not just our reputations, but our community. Who will trade with merchants who could not recognize a charlatan? Who will trust a judge who recommended a killer? Reverend Cunningham, crushed by the loss of his only daughter, still thought of his congregation. He agreed that some form of private justice would be less destructive than a trial. The families deserve truth. He said, his voice breaking, but they also deserve to live with dignity. A trial would destroy the innocent, along with the guilty. The uneasy compromise was struck. Fletcher would be forced to leave Ohio immediately. His journals, tools, and specimens would be preserved as evidence, but hidden from public view. But Fletcher refused. Cornered, he lashed out, declaring he would rather face trial than abandon his research. He threatened to expose everyone Marcus Holloway for providing the basement, the prominent families who had paid him, the leaders who had recommended his services. If he was ruined, he promised they would all be ruined with him. Through the night of November 12th, the standoff dragged on. Fletcher barricaded himself in the basement while the town's leaders argued above. Marcus Holloway, pale with fear, begged them to protect his family from being destroyed by association. By dawn on November 13th, Fletcher made his move. Attempting to escape through the basement's exterior entrance, he ran straight into Judge Putnam and Merchant Samuel Fearing, who were standing guard. When the sun rose, Fletcher was dead. His skull had been crushed against the stone steps outside the basement. Judge Putnam insisted Fletcher had slipped in the dark, striking his head on the limestone. Samuel Fearing supported him, swearing it was an accident. Yet when Dr. Hartwell examined the body, he found signs that hinted at something more violent, a blow perhaps, or a struggle that ended deliberately. Still, Hartwell, knowing the cost of the truth, signed the report as accidental trauma from a fall. Fletcher's death solved one problem, but left another. The basement beneath the Holloway farm was a vault of horrors, jars of preserved organs, surgical instruments, and Fletcher's own meticulous journals. Each page evidence of fraud, malpractice, and murder. All of it had to be hidden, and hidden quickly, before the wider world came asking questions. The men of Marietta agreed the only way forward was silence. Fletcher's basement would be sealed forever, a tomb for both the evidence of his crimes and the shame of those who had enabled them. Marcus Holloway, desperate to save his family's name, walled up the basement entrance with heavy limestone, making it look as if the space had always been part of the foundation. Ivy was planted to cover the stones, and soon the scar disappeared into the farmhouse itself. What had once been a place of horror became invisible, hidden behind brick and silence. The official story spread quickly and stuck. Dr. Amos Fletcher, it was said, had fallen to his death while bravely treating cholera patients in his private hospital. The basement had been sealed afterward to prevent further spread of infection. The patients who died under his care were chalked up to the epidemic, no different than the hundreds of others lost across Ohio that summer. Reverend Cunningham buried Fletcher with a simple service, attended only by the men who knew the truth. His headstone in Marietta Cemetery bore a modest inscription, Dr. A. Fletcher, 1796 to 1832, taken by accident in service to his patients. Families who had lost loved ones to Fletcher's treatments accepted the tale, comforted by the idea that their relatives had died under the hand of a trained physician instead of in the chaos of the public hospital. Dr. Hartwell, crushed by what he had witnessed and haunted by his silence, destroyed his own notes. He turned to drink and was dead within 3 years, the knowledge of Fletcher's true deeds buried with him. Marcus Holloway scrubbed away what remained of Fletcher's presence. He burned what could be burned, buried instruments and broken furniture in unmarked graves across his land, and swore never to speak of it again. The weight of the secret passed from him to his son Thomas, and then to his grandson Robert. Each generation knew that behind the limestone lay a truth too dangerous to unearth. In time, the wall became so much a part of the farmhouse that later Holloways forgot it had ever been anything else. Meanwhile, Fletcher's reputation, twisted by the cover-up, grew into legend. As the cholera epidemic faded into memory, he was remembered not as a killer, but as a selfless Eastern doctor who had brought advanced knowledge to the frontier and paid with his life. Sons were named Amos in his honor, and the Marietta Medical Society even established a scholarship in his memory. The Holloway farm prospered, its fields fertile, and herds multiplying. The darkness beneath the house never spoken of. Marcus lived into his late 70s, taking the secret with him when he was buried in 1878. Sarah followed a decade later, never having broken her silence. By 1900, all first-hand witnesses were gone. The sealed basement was no longer a chamber of horrors. It was merely a curiosity, an odd corner of the farmhouse no one bothered to open. Holloway descendants sometimes debated tearing it out, but the expense always outweighed the curiosity. And so the wall remained an unmarked monument to the darkest secret in Marietta's history. The Great Depression brought the Holloway family's long stewardship to an end. With debts mounting and taxes unpaid, the farm was sold off after more than a century in family hands. The new owners, immigrants from Eastern Europe, were practical farmers who cared little for Marietta's history. They worked the land efficiently, but the farmhouse itself was just shelter, not heritage. To save money, they closed off unused rooms, including the space above the bricked-up basement. Whatever secrets lay hidden beneath the limestone wall remained undisturbed. Through the 20th century, as southeastern Ohio shifted from farmland to suburban sprawl and light industry, the old Holloway farmhouse passed from one owner to the next. Each family noticed the sealed basement, but no one questioned it deeply. Most assumed it had been walled off because of flooding rot or a failed renovation. Over time, the wall simply became part of the house's eccentric charm, the kind of mystery that homeowners mention with a shrug. It wasn't until a young businessman from Columbus bought the abandoned property in the early 2000s that anyone thought to pry it open. He saw the farmhouse as a rustic weekend retreat, isolated, steeped in history, and affordable precisely because of its dilapidated condition. He hired contractors to overhaul the electrical and plumbing work that required full access to the basement. When they discovered the sealed section, they assumed it was an old patch job. But building codes demanded inspection. Whatever was behind that wall had to be verified before they could continue. On a cold spring morning, the crew began chipping away at the barrier Marcus Holloway had built nearly 2 centuries earlier. The mortar had hardened to the strength of stone, forcing them to bring in power tools. As the first cracks opened, a foul odor seeped out, stale organic, like a place long untouched by fresh air. The more stones they pried loose, the more they glimpsed objects. In the dark wooden furniture, glints of metal and rows of glass jars catching the beam of a flashlight. At last, the opening was wide enough for a man to enter. The new owner stepped through flashlight, trembling in his grip, and became the first person to set foot in Fletcher's hidden chambers since November of 1832. What he found was astonishing. The treatment table still stood at the room's center, its surface darkly stained. Surgical instruments lay scattered across side tables, their steel rusted, but still recognizable as 19th century tools. Wooden shelves held dozens of empty jars. The alcohol had long evaporated, leaving behind crusted residue of what they once contained. And on a desk in the corner lay the most damning relic of all, Fletcher's leather-bound journal. Its pages yellowed but intact, his meticulous handwriting still legible. Entry after entry detailed procedures, bloodlettings, doses of mercury, and cold notes about patients who had expired. It was a ledger of death preserved like the room itself. Recognizing the gravity of what he had uncovered, the owner contacted the Washington County Historical Society. Within days, archaeologists, medical historians, and forensic experts swarmed the farmhouse. The basement was declared one of the most important historical discoveries in the region's history. Analysis of the residue in the jars confirmed the presence of mercury. The stains on the table tested positive for human blood. Fletcher's journal, paired with the physical evidence, erased all doubt what had been whispered about for generations was true. Dr. Amos Fletcher had not been a heroic physician cut down by an epidemic. He had been a methodical killer shielded by desperation, wealth, and silence. And for nearly 2 centuries, his crimes had lain entombed beneath a farmhouse outside Marietta, Ohio. Testing of the residue inside Fletcher's bottles revealed mercury levels so high they could have killed a healthy adult in hours. Bloodstains on his instruments confirmed multiple individuals, far more than his journals recorded. And behind the farmhouse, investigators uncovered evidence of at least a dozen clandestine burials. The numbers suggested that Fletcher's ledger of death had been incomplete, that his victims may have doubled what he admitted to on paper. The historical investigation that followed transformed not only local history, but the broader understanding of medical practice on the frontier. Church ledgers, court documents, and family records from the 1830s revealed patterns of sudden deaths that had been explained away at the time. They should have raised alarms, but instead they were overlooked or deliberately hidden. Medical historians who reviewed the evidence called Fletcher's enterprise one of the most organized and systematic acts of medical murder in early America, shielded by a community more concerned with preserving its image than uncovering truth. The scope was staggering. Fletcher had killed at least 24 people over a span of 4 months, collecting fees that, in that era, amounted to fortunes. But the discovery also exposed something darker, the lengths to which Marietta's leaders had gone to erase the truth. Courthouse officials had altered death records, community leaders had suppressed stories, and ministers had vouched for Fletcher's character even after doubts surfaced. The cover-up had not been an accident. It was deliberate, coordinated, and persistent. Worse still, the case was not entirely unique. Once historians began combing through records from other Ohio towns during the same epidemic, similar patterns appeared: sudden spikes in mortality, connected to university-trained doctors, inconsistencies in burial records, whispers of patients vanishing after treatment. Fletcher may have been more brazen and prolific than most, but the conditions of the time, desperation, isolation, and lack of oversight created fertile ground for other predators disguised as physicians. The reopening of the Holloway basement forced historians to rethink how medicine was practiced, and more importantly, how it was regulated in frontier America. Fletcher's success did not rely on elaborate criminal genius. It thrived because a community chose silence over scandal. Protecting reputations became more important than protecting lives. Excavations at the Holloway farm lasted months, with experts cataloging every jar, instrument, and bone fragment. Some remains were eventually identified, allowing descendants to learn the truth generations later. Families who had long carried stories of ancestors lost to the cholera epidemic now learned that those deaths were not the work of disease at all, but of a man whose cure was more deadly than the sickness. The betrayal cut deeper when it became clear that it had not been only Fletcher's doing. Marietta's leaders had protected his name, buried the evidence, and let the lie endure for nearly 200 years. The descendants of the Holloway family, now spread across the country, reacted with a mixture of shock, grief, and grim recognition when news of the basement broke. Some were appalled to learn that their ancestral farm had been the stage for such calculated cruelty, while others admitted they felt a strange sense of relief. Family whispers of something bad in the basement had haunted their childhoods, but no one had preserved the details. Now, at last, the truth was undeniable. The investigation cast a long shadow over both local history and the broader story of American medicine. Though oversight and accountability have improved dramatically since Fletcher's time, scholars pointed out that isolated practices and vulnerable patients remain at risk even today. Fletcher's laboratory, preserved exactly as it was found, became an unflinching monument to what happens when ambition, neglect, and community silence collide. His leather-bound journal, carefully conserved, is now studied as one of the most chilling first-hand records of systematic medical abuse in the antebellum period. His instruments, along with the residue from his jars, continue to serve as evidence in studies of medical ethics and misconduct. The businessman who unearthed the sealed basement chose history over convenience. Instead of renovating the farmhouse as a retreat, he allowed researchers to preserve it as a case study in both crime and community complicity. The discovery spurred new examinations of other frontier medical sites across Ohio and beyond. While none revealed evidence as shocking as Fletcher's hidden chamber, several showed suspicious mortality patterns that hinted at malpractice, fraud, and abuse in a time when regulation was thin and oversight almost non-existent. For the families of Fletcher's victims, genealogical research and forensic analysis provided long-delayed recognition. Memorials were established not only to honor the dead, but also to emphasize the values that had failed them: accountability, transparency, and truth. In Marietta Cemetery, Fletcher's grave became the focus of debate. Some descendants demanded his removal from the section reserved for respected community members, arguing that a man who had profited from death and deceit should not rest among the honored. Others argued that leaving his modest headstone in place was more powerful, that it stood as a cautionary reminder of how a community blinded by fear and desperate for hope allowed itself to be deceived. In the end, the cholera epidemic of 1832 was responsible for thousands of deaths across Ohio. Fletcher accounted for only a fraction of that toll. Yet his story resonates more deeply than numbers. It is not just about disease, but about betrayal. The betrayal of trust, of community, of humanity itself, hidden for nearly 2 centuries behind a limestone wall. Fletcher's story does not end with the bricked-up chamber that entombed his victims and his crimes. His legacy is not one of medicine, but of betrayal. What makes his deeds so chilling is not just the deaths themselves, but the way he used the authority of a physician's title to exploit the most vulnerable families, frantic with fear, communities desperate for answers, and a society willing to look the other way to protect its own name. His victims trusted him because of his credentials, not despite them. And that betrayal makes his crimes stand as one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Medical ethicists who studied the case pointed to the perfect storm that allowed Fletcher to thrive the isolation of rural practice. The desperation created by epidemic disease, the absence of medical licensing, and most of all, a community's decision to value reputation over justice. It raises questions that extend far beyond Marietta in 1832. How many other physicians used epidemics as cover for exploitation? How many families carried false stories of loved ones cared for heroically by doctors who were in fact predators? How many communities buried the truth, just as Marcus Holloway buried Fletcher's basement, believing silence would protect them? The limestone wall that hid the chamber for 91 years is more than masonry. It is a monument to collective denial and a reminder that truth will always find its way to the surface. Fletcher's journal, with its neat lines of ink describing systematic murder disguised as treatment, warns us that the most dangerous predators are often those cloaked in respectability. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Oversight, transparency, and accountability in medicine are not luxuries but necessities, because healing can so easily turn to harm without them. Today, Fletcher's basement stands preserved not to sensationalize his crimes, but to teach. Researchers and the public walk through its cold rooms as witnesses to the consequences of unchecked authority. The preserved tools, the blood-stained table, the brittle pages of the journal all serve as stark reminders of what happens when silence replaces truth. The community leaders who sealed that space thought they were sparing their town's shame. Instead, they created a deeper shame that could only be resolved when the wall came down almost 2 centuries later. The Holloway basement demonstrates a lesson as urgent now as it was then. Silence never conceals crime. It only delays justice, multiplies harm, and ensures that when truth finally surfaces, its shadow is darker than ever. That is the enduring legacy of Fletcher's Chamber of Horrors. The story of Amos Fletcher's hidden basement forces us to confront not only his crimes, but the choices communities make when faced with uncomfortable truths. He thrived because of the same forces that have enabled abuse throughout American history: unchecked authority, vulnerable patience, and a collective unwillingness to question those who appear respectable. Fletcher's case shows that silence may shield reputations in the short term, but in the long run, it multiplies harm, spreads shame, and ensures that when truth finally emerges, its impact is devastating. His laboratory is more than just a preserved crime scene. It's part of a larger American pattern. From slavery to unethical medical experiments to industrial exploitation, our history is filled with moments where communities chose to bury evidence instead of facing it. Fletcher's basement proves that concealment doesn't erase the past. It only delays the reckoning, often for generations. The descendants of his victims learned only recently that their relatives weren't lost to cholera, but murdered under the guise of treatment, a cruel betrayal that rippled across centuries. Fletcher's leather-bound journal, with its precise handwriting and cold calculations, demonstrates 2 truths. At once, criminals often leave a record, and records are useless without people brave enough to confront them. For 91 years, that book sat untouched, its evidence ignored until chance and renovation brought it into the light. It is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are not always hiding in shadows. They may be standing in plain sight, wearing the titles and credentials that inspire our trust. And so the question remains: how many other stories like Fletcher's are still sealed behind walls, hidden beneath foundations, or disguised in official records? His basement was finally broken open after nearly 2 centuries, but America's landscape is dotted with old houses, forgotten hospitals, and abandoned buildings that may yet hold secrets waiting to be revealed. What do you think? Was everything about Fletcher truly uncovered, or might there still be more to his story, or others like it, hidden behind stone and silence? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button. If this story sent chills down your spine, and subscribe so you won't miss the next dark mystery we uncover. After all, who knows what might be waiting in the basements of America's forgotten past? Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.